Rain came down like grief quiet at first, then all at once. Charles Whitmore never noticed the cold. Not until he saw the child. The boy was no more than 8, soaked through, sitting against a lamppost outside the Fifth Avenue Cartier store, crying so quietly it was as though he didn't want the world to know he was hurting. Charles had built empires, walked across red carpets, spoken in boardrooms filled with ruthless men. But nothing, not war, not Wall Street, not the death of his beloved wife stopped him in his tracks like the sight of that boy, alone, crying, his small body shaking in the rain. He hesitated for a moment, umbrella in hand, before stepping closer. The boy flinched, shrinking into the concrete. "Hey there," Charles said, soft but clear, like coaxing a stray cat. "Are you hurt? Are you lost?" The boy didn't answer. His hands clutched something tight in his lap, a damp piece of paper, maybe, or a photograph. Charles knelt slowly, letting the umbrella tilt to shield the child. Rain spattered his custom-tailored trousers, but he didn't care. "What's your name?" The boy looked up, brown eyes wide, shining. "Eli," he whispered. "Eli," Charles repeated. "Nice to meet you. I'm Charles." He offered a hand, but Eli just stared at it, unmoving. Charles followed the boy's eyes down to what he was holding, a folded newspaper clipping. He reached for it gently. "May I?" Eli hesitated, then nodded. Charles unfolded it. It was an obituary. His heart skipped a beat. Amanda Lee, beloved mother, artist, friend, passed away June 2nd. Survived by no immediate family. "Is this your mom?" Charles asked. Eli gave the slightest nod, eyes fixed on the street. Charles felt something cold and hollow open in his chest. "Where are you staying, Eli?" Another pause. Then the whisper came, barely audible over the rain. "Nowhere." 2 hours later, Eli sat wrapped in a plush towel in Charles's penthouse, the same one once filled with laughter, long before his wife Margaret passed. The boy's small fingers curled around a cup of cocoa, untouched. Charles paced nearby, phone in hand, having called the shelter, the hospital, even a detective he knew from the old days. No one had a record of the boy. No foster care file. No next of kin. It was as if Eli had appeared out of nowhere, cradling a mother's death notice in a silence too deep for someone his age. "Why were you sitting there in the rain?" Charles asked gently. Eli looked up. "I was waiting for the man in the suit." Charles blinked. "What man?" The boy frowned, as if trying to remember something he wasn't sure he'd seen. "The man my mom said would find me. She said if anything ever happened, he'd be wearing a blue suit and a red tie." Charles froze. He looked down. Blue suit, red tie. Rain still clung to his clothes. Eli's voice came again, this time more certain. She said his name was Charles Whitmore. Charles hadn't heard that name in a decade from anyone who didn't work for him. The world called him Mr. Whitmore, Sir, or Chairman. But Amanda Lee had known him once, when she was just Mandy, a vibrant, starving artist who painted on the sidewalk in Central Park. He remembered. She had borrowed $100 from him once, laughing that she'd pay him back with a painting. She never did, but he still had that painting, her first, framed on the wall beside his study. Amanda had disappeared from his life 30 years ago, and now this child. "You knew my mother?" he asked, voice suddenly trembling. Eli nodded, eyes lighting up for the first time. "She used to tell me stories. About the man who helped her. About how he was kind, even though he looked angry." Charles chuckled, actually chuckled for the first time in years. Eli's face turned solemn. "She said she was scared to tell you about me." Charles felt the room tilt. "Eli, are you saying?" The boy nodded again, but this time, he pulled something from his backpack. A small, water-damaged envelope. Inside was a letter. Amanda's handwriting. He knew it instantly. "Charles, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone. I never meant to keep Eli from you. I was scared off what it meant, of who I was, of who you had become. But I've told him everything about you. I hope you can forgive me, and I hope you'll be for him what you once were for me. Hope. Always. Mandy." Charles sat down. Hard. His hand trembled as he held the letter. That night, Eli fell asleep curled on the velvet couch under Margaret's old quilt, the one she used to drape over Charles when he worked too late. The city lights flickered below the penthouse windows. Charles stood at the glass, silent. The past surged forward with every heartbeat. Regret, guilt, wonder. Could it be true? Could this small boy, orphaned by fate, be his son? Or worse, his grandson? The math didn't add up. Charles wasn't just wealthy. He was calculating. He did numbers the way people did breathing. And the numbers in this case didn't lie. Mandy had disappeared 30 years ago. Eli was maybe 8. Charles picked up the phone. "Jacob," he said into the line. His lawyer answered immediately. "Yes, Mr. Whitmore. I need a DNA test. Quiet. Discreet. Tomorrow." "Understood." He hung up. Behind him, Eli stirred in his sleep. "Please," Charles whispered into the dark. "Let it be true." The next morning, Charles made pancakes from scratch, Margaret's old recipe. Burnt the first batch. Eli laughed for the first time. They talked about school, about Amanda's paintings, about the little dog Eli had named Pretzel, who was now with a neighbor. As the test was taken and sent out, Charles found himself hoping for something he'd never hoped for, that the boy was his. Not because of guilt, not because of duty, but because for the first time in 20 years, Charles felt something inside him shift, something heavy and silent that had been weighing down his chest ever since Margaret died. Eli didn't just need him. He needed Eli. 3 days later, the test came back. Negative. Charles sat in the study, the unopened envelope on his desk, and stared at the wall for a long, long time. Eli was not his son, not his grandson, not family at all. But when he looked out into the living room and saw the boy curled up with a book, Margaret's copy of Charlotte's Web, bookmarked at the same page she used to read to their daughter, who realized something with terrifying clarity. He didn't need blood to love him. And maybe, just maybe, Eli's unbelievable story wasn't about genetics. It was about fate and second chances. Charles didn't sleep that night. He stood by the window, Manhattan glowing below, thoughts racing faster than the traffic 25 floors beneath him. The DNA test sat on the desk behind him, untouched since he opened it, like a cold verdict from the universe. Not his, not family. And yet, he could still hear Eli's quiet laugh as they fed Pretzel in the kitchen that morning. Still see the way the boy had traced his fingers along Margaret's old piano, reverent, like it held magic. Charles hadn't believed in magic for a very long time. But somehow, this boy had walked into his life and pulled light from corners he'd forgotten were even there. Eli wasn't his blood, but he was his reason. At breakfast, Charles made eggs. The second batch wasn't burnt. Eli looked up from his plate. "Are you mad at me?" The question hit like a punch. "Why would you think that?" Charles asked, carefully sitting down. "Because of the paper." Eli meant the DNA results. "Because I'm not yours." Charles leaned forward, elbows on the table. "Eli, that doesn't matter to me." The boy frowned. "But I thought you'd only help me if I was family." Charles reached across the table and gently took his hand. "You are family, kiddo, whether the paper says so or not." Eli looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. It was the smallest nod, but it was everything. Later that afternoon, they took a walk through Central Park. The air was crisp, summer fading into fall, leaves painting the ground in warm oranges and reds. Charles hadn't walked here in years, not since Margaret's funeral. He avoided places that made him feel. But Eli made him brave. They passed street performers, vendors, the old bridge where Amanda once used to sit with her sketchbook. Eli tugged on Charles's coat and pointed to the exact bench Amanda had painted in the watercolor he still kept in his study. "She told me stories about that place," Eli said softly. "Said she used to dream here." Charles smiled, but it was sad. "She was always dreaming. She said you helped her buy her first canvas, and that you told her she had something special." "I did," Charles said. "Because she did." They sat down together on that very bench, quiet for a moment. Then Eli pulled something from his jacket. A worn notebook. He opened it, revealing page after page of drawings. Some were simple, others detailed. A few were startlingly good. She taught me how, Eli said shyly. Said drawing helps when the world feels too loud. Charles looked through the sketches: pretzel, Amanda, buildings from memory, even one of Charles from behind, staring out the penthouse window. You have talent, Charles said. I had a good teacher. He wanted to say more, wanted to tell Eli that his mother would be proud, that she lived in every pencil line and smudge, but before he could, Eli looked up. There's something else. Charles waited. She didn't just send me to find you, she told me to give you something. Eli reached into his backpack and pulled out a small wooden box. Inside was an envelope. Another letter. Amanda's handwriting again. Charles, if you're still reading, it means you didn't walk away. Thank you for that. There's more you need to know. About Eli. About me. I kept secrets, not to hurt you, but to protect him and you. I never told you about the years after we parted ways. About the man I met. About how he wasn't kind. How Eli wasn't his. Either, not really, not in any way that matters. I made mistakes, but loving Eli was never one of them. I told him stories about you because I needed him to believe there were good men left in the world. Please don't let my past rob him of his future. If there's anything left of the man I knew, he'll take care of Eli. Not out of guilt, but because you'll see him the way I did, bright, kind, brave beyond his years. All my hope. Amanda. Charles closed his eyes. His throat burned. She had suffered, and she had protected her child until the very end. And now it was his turn. That evening, Charles made a decision. He called a friend at the state office and began the paperwork for emergency guardianship. It was complicated, especially without documentation, but Charles Whitmore was not a man the system said no to. In the days that followed, he turned his penthouse into a home again. Margaret's old music box was dusted off. A room was transformed for Eli, walls painted soft green, filled with books and sketch pads and a small telescope for stargazing. Every night, Charles read to Eli from the books Margaret used to love. And every night, Eli asked a new question about the stars, about kindness, about whether good people always win. Charles never knew how to answer that. But he told the truth. No, but they keep trying anyway. That's what makes them good. 2 weeks later, a woman named Carol from Child Services paid a visit. She was kind-eyed and efficient, surprised by the address on the file. Mr. Whitmore, she said, stepping into the penthouse. I wasn't expecting you. I wasn't expecting him, Charles replied, gesturing to Eli, who was painting quietly at the dining table. Carol spent an hour asking questions, observing their interaction. When she finally stood, she gave Charles a long, evaluating look. You understand this isn't temporary. I'm not interested in temporary, Charles said firmly. I want to adopt him. She blinked. You want to adopt him? Charles nodded. I have more money than I'll ever spend. I've built towers and torn down competitors. But this boy gave me something I didn't even know I was missing. She softened. A second chance. He smiled. A reason. 3 days later, Carol returned. The paperwork had been fast-tracked discreetly, but legally. And in the envelope she carried was an official court order. Charles Whitmore was now Eli Lee's legal guardian. He didn't cry often, not since Margaret. But when Eli threw his arms around him and said, "Does this mean I get to stay with you forever?" he did. Quietly, deeply. He just nodded and held on. The months passed. Winter came, and with it, snowball fights in Central Park, evenings by the fireplace, new traditions, and quiet healing. Eli's nightmares grew less frequent. His laughter more confident. Charles began to change too. He cut back at the firm, took fewer calls, spent mornings making pancakes and nights listening to Eli read aloud from his favorite books. People noticed. The media called it a retirement. Charles didn't bother correcting them. He wasn't retiring. He was starting over. But peace is rarely uninterrupted. And one day, the past knocked on their door in the form of a man named Vincent Price. He wore a cheap suit, a crooked grin, and carried the scent of trouble. "Mr. Whitmore," he said as Charles opened the door, "I believe you have something that belongs to me." Charles's spine stiffened. "I don't think so." The man pulled out a folded document told, weathered. "Eli Lee. I'm his father. Biological. I want custody." Charles didn't blink. "You have proof. Birth certificate. And history with the mother. Doesn't that count?" Charles stared at him, ice in his veins. Vincent leaned in. "I could make this messy. Or I could walk away. For the right price." Charles Whitmore had negotiated billion-dollar mergers. But nothing prepared him for the fury that surged through him now. "You're extorting me. I'm offering a solution." Charles leaned in. "I don't negotiate with cowards. Get off my property." Vincent grinned. "Then I'll see you in court." He turned and walked away. And Charles closed the door with hands that trembled not from fear, but from fury. Behind him, Eli stood frozen in the hallway, eyes wide. "You hurt?" Charles asked softly. Eli nodded. "That manha." Charles walked over, knelt down. "He doesn't get to take you. Do you hear me? He doesn't get to win." Eli's lip quivered. "I don't want to go back." "You won't," Charles said. "I promise you. Not ever." But promises weren't enough. The next chapter would be a battle. In court. In the press. Against bloodlines and bureaucracy. And Charles would fight harder than he ever had in business. Because this time, he wasn't protecting his name. He was protecting his heart. The first court hearing was set for January 12th. The day arrived colder than most. The air was bitter, and the sky threatened snow. Charles stood outside the courthouse in a navy overcoat, one hand holding Eli's gloved fingers, the other resting on the boy's shoulder. Inside the courtroom, Vincent Price sat with a smug grin, his lawyer some low-rate family attorney from Queens adjusting his tie nervously. The judge was a woman in her 60s, stern, deliberate, and visibly unimpressed with Vincent's presentation of himself as a concerned biological father. Vincent stood and began. "I want to be clear," he said, voice trembling with false emotion. "I only recently learned Amanda passed. I didn't know Eli had nowhere to go. When I found out, I did what any father would do." The judge raised an eyebrow. "And where were you for the first 8 years of this child's life?" Vincent fumbled. "Amanda, she moved around a lot. I couldn't find her." Charles's lawyer, Jacob Heller, rose calmly. "Your Honor, my client has evidence showing Mr. Price was incarcerated for aggravated assault during the first 4 years of Eli's life. We also have police records detailing 2 restraining orders Amanda Lee filed against him, as well as Child Protective Services reports citing domestic abuse." Vincent leapt from his seat. "She lied. She was trying to keep him from me." The judge slammed the gavel. "Sit down, Mr. Price." Charles remained composed, but inside, his heart hammered like a war drum. Eli sat beside him, clenching his small fists. The judge looked at them both for a long time before speaking. "Mr. Whitmore, why do you want custody of this child if you're not biologically related to him?" Charles stood, voice steady. "Because I love him. Because he belongs with someone who puts him first. And because I won't let him be tossed back into the chaos his mother fought so hard to escape. Biology doesn't make a father, Your Honor. Commitment does." A silence followed. Even Vincent said nothing. The hearing was adjourned, but not decided. Outside the courtroom, reporters had already caught wind of the story. A billionaire battles for custody of orphan boy. Blood versus bond. The Whitmore case sparks national debate. Cameras flashed. Microphones shoved forward. But Charles ignored them. He only cared about the boy beside him, who gripped his hand a little tighter every time someone shouted a question. That night, back in the penthouse, Eli was quiet. He picked at his food, then pushed the plate away. Charles sat across from him. "Want to talk about it?" Eli shook his head. But then, after a moment, he whispered, "What if they take me away anyway?" Charles pushed back his chair and walked over, kneeling beside him. "That's not going to happen. You don't know that." "No," Charles said softly. "But I know this. I will fight every day, in every court, against every man, to keep you safe. I don't care what it takes. I won't stop. Eli finally looked at him. Even if I'm not yours. Charles smiled gently. You are mine. In every way that matters. The boy nodded and finally, after days of silence, wrapped his arms around Charles's neck. Neither of them said a word for a long time. The next few weeks were a storm of legal documents, interviews with psychologists, home visits from caseworkers, and background checks. Charles passed every one. He even sat down with a family therapist, at the court's request, to evaluate his emotional bond with Eli. I've never raised a child, Charles admitted. Not since my daughter died. She passed away? The therapist asked gently. 20 years ago, Charles said. Car accident. She was only 12. A silence settled in the room. I never thought I'd get the chance to be that kind of father again, he continued. But Eli's reopened something in me I thought was long dead. I'm not trying to replace anyone. I just want to be his safe place. The therapist nodded, scribbled a few notes. Do you love him? With everything I have left. Meanwhile, Vincent Price began his campaign in the press. He painted himself as a reformed man, exploited by the system and robbed of his son by a billionaire who wanted a pet project. Tabloids ran wild with the headline. Father fights back. Eli's real dad wants him home. But every lie he told was countered by fact. Charles's legal team was relentless. So was his heart. One night, Eli crawled into Charles's bed after a nightmare. I saw him, he whispered. He was taking me away. You didn't say anything. Charles opened his eyes. Eli, I would never let that happen. But what if he tricks the judge? Charles turned to face him. Then we untrick her. Or we go higher. We don't give up. I'm scared. I am too, Charles admitted. But courage isn't not being scared. It's loving someone so much, you show up anyway. On the final day of the trial, the courtroom was packed. The judge took her time reading over the files. Then she looked down at Vincent. Mr. Price, you have provided proof of paternity, yes. But you have provided no evidence of emotional connection, financial support, or personal responsibility. Vincent's face darkened. She turned to Charles. And you, Mr. Whitmore, you are not related to this child. But the home you've built, the protection you've given, and the bond I've witnessed in this courtroom are undeniable. Then her gaze moved to Eli. Eli, she said gently, do you want to speak? Charles said, but Eli stood. He walked to the front of the court, stood on tiptoe to reach the microphone. His voice was soft, but clear. I know he's not my dad on paper, but Mr. Charles gave me food when I was hungry, a bed when I was cold. He makes me laugh when I feel sad. And he never yells. Never. He paused. My mom said he would be the one. She was right. I want to stay. A hush fell over the room. The judge took a breath. Thank you, Eli. She turned back to the bench, took her gavel and delivered the ruling. Full guardianship is granted to Mr. Charles Whitmore, effective immediately. Charles's breath left his chest. Eli ran to him. They held each other right there in the courtroom, as Vincent stormed out. Back home, they made a cake. A crooked one, badly iced, but it didn't matter. It was their cake, their life, their beginning. I guess that makes it official, Charles said. Eli grinned. I'm yours now. You always were. In the weeks that followed, Charles filed formal adoption papers. He made Eli the sole heir to his estate. Not to prove anything, but to undo generations of emptiness and isolation. He introduced Eli to his board not as a guest, but as his son. Some raised eyebrows. Others smiled quietly. Nobody dared question him. Spring bloomed in Central Park. Eli's art was accepted into a children's gallery. One piece was a watercolor of the first night they met Charles, kneeling in the rain, umbrella tilted, face stunned. I call it found, Eli told the gallery owner. Charles just smiled. I call it saved. But one letter still waited, sealed in a drawer. Amanda's final note. He opened it on a quiet Sunday, alone in his study. Charles, if you're reading this, it means you stayed. You chose love over logic, Heart over blood. Thank you. Tell Eli I'm proud of him. And tell him. He was never lost. He just hadn't been found yet. Charles folded the letter slowly. Then he stood, walked to Eli's room, and tucked the letter beneath his pillow. Some truths deserve to rest close to the heart. 3 days after the judge's ruling, Charles received an unexpected visitor. Carol, the caseworker who'd overseen the adoption process, stepped out of the elevator holding a manila folder, her face unreadable. "I'm sorry to drop in unannounced," she said as Charles welcomed her in. "But something's come up. Something you need to see." Charles felt a flicker of unease. Eli was in his room, painting. Carol sat, opening the folder slowly. "This is from a safe deposit box Amanda left behind. It was just released by probate. There are letters, photographs, and one name." She slid a paper across the table. "Josephine Whitmore." Charles stared. "My wife's name was Margaret," he said, confused. Carol nodded. "Josephine was your daughter. This is Amanda's old diary. The final entries. I think you should read it." Charles picked it up slowly, hands trembling as he turned the brittle pages. The handwriting was familiar, free-flowing, alive, full of life, even in grief. December 3rd. I saw her again. Josephine, Charles's daughter. I don't think she recognized me, but I recognized her. Same dimple when she laughed. Same fierce spark behind her eyes. She was alive. Alive. I followed her, just for a moment. Enough to know she wasn't safe. The man she was with, he wasn't kind. I knew that kind of darkness. I'd lived it. I didn't interfere. But I wanted to. I should have. Charles's throat tightened. Josephine had died in a car crash 20 years ago. There had been a body. A funeral. Closure. But he kept reading. December 17th. She's not dead. Josephine faked it. Or someone faked it for her. I don't know why. But I saw her again. At the clinic. She was crying. Pregnant. Alone. She left before I could speak. He dropped the journal. Carol placed a hand on his arm. "Mr. Whitmore," she said gently, "there's a real possibility your daughter didn't die in that accident. And that Eli isn't Amanda's biological child." Charles's world tilted. "Are you saying?" Carol hesitated. "We believe Amanda raised Eli as her own. But based on these entries in a match from a closed hospital record, Eli may, in fact, be Josephine's son. Your biological grandson." Charles felt the air leave his lungs. All this time, all the hope, the grief, the fighting, and the boy he had come to love wasn't just love by choice. He was loved by blood. He didn't tell Eli immediately. What mattered now was how he told him when, and with what care. He needed to know more first. He reopened the case of Josephine Whitmore, hired private investigators, reviewed death certificates, medical records, dental reports, and what he discovered left him cold. The crash had been real, but the girl in the car wasn't his daughter. It was a friend driving Josephine's car, wearing her coat. There had been no DNA confirmation. Charles had accepted her death because grief made truth feel like cruelty. He'd never asked questions. But Josephine had disappeared that night, and 6 months later Amanda had a baby. The next lead came from a recovery shelter in Brooklyn. A former nurse recognized a photo of Josephine. She was here, maybe a decade ago. Looked broken, scared. She never used her real name. Said she had to disappear. She had a child? The nurse nodded. A little boy. Quiet. Always drawing. He called her Joe. Charles thanked her, left a generous donation, and returned home more shaken than ever. Everything pointed to the truth. Amanda had raised Eli not out of obligation but love, as her best friend's final request. He wasn't just Charles's purpose. He was his legacy. That night, Charles sat on Eli's bed, the lights low. Eli looked up from his sketchpad. "You okay?" "I found something," Charles said gently. "About your mom. About your family." Eli set the pencil down. "She's still gone. I know that. I know. But she wasn't your biological mother." Eli's brow furrowed. Charles continued. "She loved you more than life itself. But there's more. You had another mother. Her name was Josephine. The boy's voice was barely a whisper. Who was she? Charles placed a hand on Eli's. She was my daughter. Silence filled the room. The boy blinked, eyes wide. You're my grandson, Eli. Eli sat back, stunned. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then the boy whispered, Why didn't she stay? I don't know, Charles said honestly. But I'm going to find out. Eli nodded, slowly. And then he smiled. A quiet, shaking, beautiful smile. You are my family. I always was, Charles said. We just didn't know how deep it went. Spring faded into summer. Charles and Eli visited Amanda's resting place, planting lilies her favorite. She saved me, Eli said, pressing his hand to the stone, even when she didn't have to. Charles nodded. Some love goes beyond explanation, beyond choice. He placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. We carry that love forward. In the months that followed, Charles established a foundation in Amanda's name dedicated to housing, therapy, and education for displaced children. Eli spoke at the launch event. He stood, nervous at first, but steady. My mom wasn't rich, but she gave me everything. And now I get to share that with other kids like me. He smiled, glancing toward Charles in the front row. Because sometimes miracles look like people in raincoats with umbrellas. And sometimes they look like you. The audience stood in ovation. Charles wiped a tear, letting it fall. And still one question remained. Where was Josephine? He never stopped looking, never gave up the search. Until one September afternoon, a call came from a rehab center in Vermont. I think we have someone you've been looking for, the voice said. He drove through the night. The building was old, but well kept. Trees swayed gently in the breeze. Inside, a woman sat at the window. Her hair was streaked with gray, her face thinner. But her eyes. He knew those eyes. She turned slowly as he entered. Dad? Her voice cracked like dry wood. Charles fell to his knees. My God, he whispered. It is you. She stood barely, then collapsed into his arms. I'm sorry, she choked. I was ashamed. I thought I'd ruined everything. You're alive, he said. That's all that matters. They stayed like that for a long time. Later, as he told her about Eli, about Amanda, the court, the fight, the love tears flowed freely down her face. You raised him, right? She whispered. He raised me, Charles said. And when she was ready, he brought her home. Eli stood frozen when he saw her. But Josephine knelt, opening her arms. And the boy ran to her, crying harder than he had in months. I missed you, he sobbed. I missed you more. They didn't let go for a long time. Charles stood back, letting the moment breathe, his chest full. He had lost so much. But somehow, against all odds, she had found them both again. Eli, Josephine. Family not broken by time, but shaped by it. And in the quiet of that New York evening, Charles Whitmore, billionaire, widower, survivor, finally felt whole. The sun filtered through the tall windows of the penthouse, bathing everything in the golden hue of a Manhattan autumn morning. On the balcony, Eli sat with his sketch pad, eyes narrowed in focus as he traced delicate lines across the page. Inside, Charles stood quietly, watching his grandson, the boy who had come into his life as a mystery and grown into its very meaning. Behind him, Josephine sipped tea. Her hands still trembled from time to time. Recovery, both emotional and physical, was a steep climb. But she was climbing. I never thought I'd see him again, she whispered. Charles turned. He never stopped needing you. But you gave him the one person who could hold him until you could come back, Amanda. Josephine's eyes glistened. Do you think she forgave me? I think she loved you too much not to. There was a long silence before Josephine said, I want to be in his life. But I'm scared. I don't know how. Charles nodded. You start small. You listen. You show up. You don't try to reclaim just to be there. Josephine smiled faintly. Sounds like what you did for him. Charles looked out the window again. No, I think he did that for me. Later that week, Charles took Eli to a gallery downtown. It was a small exhibition, just 20 pieces, but one entire wall was dedicated to the children of the Amanda Lee Foundation. Among them was Eli's painting, the one of the night Charles had found him in the rain. Beneath it, a plaque read, "That night, I was found Eli Whitmore." Charles stared at the name. He hadn't even known the boy had taken it. His heart swelled. "You're sure about the name?" he asked softly. Eli shrugged with a smile. "It fits, right?" Charles nodded, voice thick. "It fits." Josephine began therapy sessions with a trauma counselor. She spent mornings in quiet rooms and afternoons in the sun with Eli, working slowly to rebuild what she had lost. They painted together. They spoke in fragments at first, then in stories. One day, she brought out a box. "I kept these," she told Eli, hands shaking. "Photos. Your baby blanket. Letters I wrote when I was too scared to mail them." Eli opened the box, reverent. Among the items was a tiny hand-knit sweater, his name embroidered in fading thread. "Eli." He looked up at her, eyes soft. "You loved me even then?" "I never stopped," she said. "I just didn't know how to love myself, too." He stood and hugged her. Charles watched from the hall, hand over his mouth. But even joy comes with storms. Charles received a call one morning from his physician. "It's about your scan," the doctor said quietly. "There's something we need to talk about." Charles drove alone to the hospital. Eli was at school. Josephine was at a group meeting. He didn't want to alarm anyone. He sat in the sterile white office, heart pounding. The doctor didn't mince words. "There's a mass," he said. "Pancreatic. We caught it early, but it's aggressive. We'll do everything we can." Charles didn't hear much after that. He stared at a single painting on the wall, a peaceful landscape of trees, and thought of Amanda, of Margaret, of Josephine's suffering, of Eli's small, vulnerable heart. He had just found them again. He couldn't leave them now. He didn't tell them right away. Instead, he poured his energy into life. He took Eli to the symphony, taught him chess, took Josephine and Eli to the coast, where they scattered the rest of Amanda's ashes into the Atlantic, her favorite ocean. They laughed together on the beach that day, built a sandcastle. But that night, alone in his room, Charles cried harder than he had in years. Eventually, he told Josephine first. She listened, frozen. "No," she whispered. "Not now. Not you." "I'll fight it," Charles said. "But you need to be ready." "For what?" "For everything." He made legal arrangements, transferred ownership of his company to a foundation, with Eli as future chair and Josephine as trustee. He gave the penthouse to Eli, in trust. He left letters, so many letters tucked in drawers, under pillows, in books. One for every birthday, every milestone, every doubt Eli might have in his life ahead. He didn't tell the boy about the cancer. Not yet. Eli had just gotten his world back. Charles couldn't shatter it again. One day, they walked together in Central Park. Leaves spiraled in the wind. Eli ran ahead, arms out like airplane wings. Charles sat on the same bench where he had found Amanda painting decades earlier. Josephine sat beside him. "I wish I could trade places," she whispered. "You brought us back. You don't deserve this." "Life isn't about what we deserve," Charles replied. "It's about what we do with the time we have." She looked down. "What do you want me to tell him? When the time comes." Charles stared at the boy in the distance. "Tell him I was proud. Every day, even when I didn't say it. Especially when I didn't say it." The treatment began. Charles grew weaker. The sparkle in his eyes dimmed, though never fully disappeared. Eli noticed, but didn't understand. "You're tired a lot," he said one day. "I'm just old," Charles smiled. "Promise you're okay?" Charles hesitated. "I promise to always love you," he said. One cold December evening, Charles lay in bed, breath shallow, skin pale. Josephine sat beside him, holding his hand. "Are you scared?" she asked. "No," he whispered. "I've had more than most men could ever dream of. Money, love, redemption." He turned to her, voice barely audible. "Make sure he keeps painting, that he sees the stars, that he forgives, and that he always, always finds the courage to love. Josephine nodded, crying silently. Eli stood in the doorway. Charles saw him, smiled. "Come here, son." Eli climbed into the bed and curled up beside him. "I love you," the boy said. "I know," Charles whispered. "And that's more than enough." Charles Whitmore passed away just before dawn. He was 78, his hand in his grandson's. The funeral was quiet, private, but across the city, lights dimmed. Newspapers told the story of a reclusive billionaire who found family in the most unexpected of places. But Eli didn't read the papers. He only read one letter, left under his pillow. "Dear Eli, the night I found you, I thought I was saving you. But the truth is, you saved me. You reminded me that even in the coldest city, in the darkest moment, there's still warmth, still light, still purpose. Love people, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. Forgive yourself. Paint with your heart. And when the world feels heavy, look to the rain. Somewhere, a man in a suit is still kneeling down, offering shelter. All my love, Granddad." 10 years later, a young man stood before a crowd of students at NYU, giving the annual Amanda Lee Memorial Lecture on Compassion and Art. He wore a simple gray blazer. His sketches had been featured in galleries across Europe. His nonprofit had built housing for over 500 at-risk kids. He cleared his throat. "My name is Eli Whitmore. I was once a kid crying in the rain, and a stranger gave me an umbrella." He paused. "But he gave me more than that. He gave me home." Applause erupted. And in the back row, Josephine smiled, hand resting on her chest, where her father's letter still lived. That night, as rain whispered against the windows of the Whitmore Foundation building, Eli stood by the window and looked out over the city. He still missed him. He always would. But grief had turned to gratitude. And love, unexpected, unchosen, unwavering, had lit the rest of his life. The boy who had been found was now the man who would keep finding others. And just like that night all those years ago, he stepped into the rain and waited. The end.